5 years old, I would have explained Easter to you as Jesus dying on the cross for my sins. I would have understood that there had to be a violent, bloody payment for the wrongdoings of humanity. And I believed that Jesus paid the price and that his rising was our hope for life in heaven with God. Deconstructing those beliefs about Jesus' experience on the cross has been one of my favorite experiences of the shift from the religion of my youth to the spirituality of my adult life. To release all beliefs that an angry God must punish, and that only those who believe that will live. And beyond the release of this old and, I'd argue, harmful narrative is the gift of what I've been able to believe in its place. To gain an expansive view of the death and resurrection that holds within it a universal story for every living thing. To see that resurrection is not really an ideology at all. It's not even really a belief. Resurrection is actually just universal and organic truth. It's bound by no religion, bound by no doctrine, no story, no individual, no group. It's simply reality. It's the human condition and Earth's structure, that we grow new skin and build new societies, that no earthly kingdom has the power to stop human flourishing, because the reality of divine love is an upside-down reality, where what is lost is found and where the last are first and what has died will rise. This universal perspective of the death and resurrection narrative, it's life-altering and life-giving. It breeds hope. It breeds connection and unconditional love. It inspires me to tend to life with every fiber of my being, and in every choice I make and every interaction I have with other beloved children of God. So a universal perspective of Jesus' death and resurrection is a gift and is, I believe, deeply spiritually true. And as beautiful and important as the universal is, I think it's still imperative to remember, especially today in the United States of America, the specific of Jesus' death and resurrection. Is his dying and rising a metaphor that holds all living things together in the truth of our resiliency? Yes. Yeah. And Jesus didn't just die and rise again. Jesus was crucified and rose again. The metaphor, the archetype, the narrative that we reflect on during this Easter season is not simply the pattern of dying and rising. That's a beautiful new perspective I've gained in my progressive faith. But it's the metaphor, the archetype, the narrative of being crucified and rising.
As strange as it may sound, crucifixion has kind of become normalized these past 2 millennia. Oh yeah, death by nailing to a wooden cross. Yeah, that's totes the thing that happened. Actually, even I would argue even more than that, even more than being normalized, it's also been kind of glorified, which is a little bizarre if you think about it, like decorating our places of worship and adorning our body and jewelry all in the shape of a cross. The fact that this doesn't immediately cause us to grimace reveals the successful normalization of crucifixion. If we wore necklaces with little electric chairs on them, or if we put giant needles of lethal injection on the steeples of our churches, then we might at least reintroduce the shock value of a cross that existed 2,000 years ago. And one consequence of this numbing to the cross, I think, is an ignorance, or maybe just a forgetting of what it actually meant that Jesus was crucified. Let me say that again. Jesus was crucified. Now, that lack of, I don't know, maybe that lack of much of anything that you're experiencing right now, that blank stare where you're like, yeah, okay. So that's what I mean by the normalization of crucifixion. But 2,000 years ago, I promise you would have had some kind of reaction to that sentiment. Although your response would largely depend on whose team you played for. If you were a Roman citizen and someone told you about a crucifixion, you'd probably shrug your shoulders and think, I'm sure they deserved it. But if you were a Jewish peasant farming the hills of Galilee and you heard about a crucifixion, you'd respond very differently. Your heart rate would increase. Your Your stomach would knot up. You'd panic and hope that it wasn't someone that you knew or that it didn't happen too near your hometown. Crucifixion was, to put it plainly, the most lethal weapon of the imperial arsenal. There was no greater show of power than the cross. It was how Rome simultaneously squashed anyone who opposed their rule and served as this ultimate deterrent against sedition. The cross was how Rome reminded their conquerees who was in charge. It symbolized the worst degree of suffering that could be inflicted upon another person. Let me say that again. The cross symbolized the worst kind of suffering that could be perpetrated upon another person. I'm not saying there might not exist other more intense kinds of suffering. I'm saying, if nothing else, the cross says this is as bad as it gets. This is symbolizing suffering. And Jesus, to say it one more time, was crucified. As much as we might not know about the life of Jesus outside the Gospels, this seems to be the one thing that all historians can agree on. Oh yeah, that guy, he was crucified. And yet, as I'm sure you've heard before, all accounts of Jesus' life, they stress this very important detail, that he was innocent. At the very least, innocent of the crimes that he was accused of and then sentenced by. And even more than that, there were those who swore he'd never done wrong by nobody his entire life. Some people even suggest that he was, quote, sinless. But the point is, no matter how you slice it, Jesus was a victim in the truest sense of the word. A victim of Roman imperial oppression, combined with being a victim of religious elites who were scared that he was leading people astray and might cause Rome to come at them even harder. And so by the hands of both the church and the state, Jesus was crucified. Consider this then, this juxtaposition. Crucifixion, the epitome of oppressive might, combined with Jesus, the epitome of innocent victim. In other words, it seems accurate enough to me to call the cross on Golgotha, where the Christ was executed, perhaps the most precise and true example of injustice. Injustice. I submit to you that when we see a cross, we should think unjust. We should think symbol of imperial power and oppression. We should think where victims go to be reminded that their life has no real value.
And so it is that kind of death that God rolls away the tomb and rises from. We see in the Jesus whose nail-scarred hands touch his friends again, that God looks at crucifixion and says, no, it's not the way of things. It's not my way. It is ironic that the story of Jesus on the cross was ever told as a story of God's violence, when really it's a story about the violence of unjust systems here on earth, and a God who refuses to be complicit in it.
The resurrection of Jesus, I think it pulled back the veil on the worst that evil could do to Jesus. And it said, well, if that's all you got, if that's the best you can do, guess what? Love and light, still stronger.
The empty tomb, it's where God speaks of her unfathomable grace toward a humanity whose propensity is to crucify. She says, whatever you crucify, I'll resurrect. It's about a God who restores in the face of our violence and mayhem. Again, the irony of ever telling it as a story of a God who responds to our wickedness with vengeance, when it's actually the exact opposite. The story of a God who responds, even in the face of our worst atrocities on earth, with fierce, enduring love.
Resurrection, yes, universally, it's about new life. And the resurrection is about exposing the feebleness of empire's pathetic grasp on power. The resurrection stares injustice right in its ugly face and says, give me all you got, baby, because at the end of the day, you ain't going to win.
And so, friends, as we move about this world in appreciation of the universal Christ, may we also remember deeply and appreciate the specific, to look around our landscape today and to see and to honor the specific stories of crucifixion that are still being lived. We're still living out crucifixion because we missed the message. We distorted the message, flipped the script, and made God executioner.
And so may we abide in the love of a God who is adamantly opposed to the injustice of the cross.
And may we, like the women who loved Jesus, may we move as close as possible toward those who are being crucified. May we stay all through the Saturday of unimaginable grief, where Sunday's rising can't yet be seen or known. Learn to sit with that discomfort, that aching, that rage and holy grief, and let it change us.
And may we hold onto this dangerous, impossible hope that somehow, in some way, the day of rising is still coming.
Amen.